So since this was a bit of a thematic exam, I thought maybe we should talk about the introduction for a moment. First, the idea that unfortunately so many people refuse to get vaccinated, and as a result, this pandemic has not ended and will not end in the foreseeable future. We will continue to be required to wear masks in public and avoid large gatherings, and we'll continue to see relatively large numbers of deaths per week until either these people die off or the virus mutates into something that is just not as lethal. Neither of those is likely to be a quick process. So that's where you can kind of read some frustration here. Yes, very much so. So let's talk about it. If you're not vaccinated and you get infected, you're going to need a treatment. There aren't that many of them. There are a few that have been moderately successful, all of which are technically very difficult to handle. Donor plasma, of course, requires an adequate number of donors and requires the handling of it. Monoclonal antibodies, this so-called cocktail that saved our former president when his foolishness caught up with him, again, requires relatively expensive materials and relatively specialized handling, also still intravenous. Same for remdesivir, the first drug that was talked about. It's an antiviral, it's an older one, but it actually had some apparent use here. But again, specialized equipment, specialized storage in some cases, very unlikely that that's going to become a worldwide administered drug because of the technological limitations. So that's the big deal here. The one we're talking about here, the one I used as a model for this exam, let's scroll down here, this is Monopovir. This is very similar to a nucleic acid. Now, you haven't gotten to that yet in this course, but you may have seen them before. That's the idea, is it's fooling some of the machinery of the virus into incorporating something that it can't use, basically encouraging it to eat something that it can't digest. So it shuts it off. It's not perfect, of course. The dosing is still something that has to be worked out, but that's the idea, is that if it can't use it, it gets stuck because it can use part of it. So it hooks up, for instance, on this alcohol group, where you see my hand here, but then doesn't have the functionality to do the rest of the job. So it doesn't finish the job synthesis-wise, and therefore doesn't replicate properly, and the virus eventually stops replicating, and the end. Your immune system can take care of it given enough time. The big deal here is that this does not require special storage. This is an easily available, easily storable, easily shippable, easily manufacturable, which is very rare, molecule. So the idea is that this technology can be transferred to pretty much any place that can build a factory. And it doesn't even have to be that complex of a factory compared to the type of things that are required to manufacture antibodies or manufacture vaccines, unfortunately. So this is, at the moment, looked upon as a potential game changer, that it could be available in places where the vaccine is very unlikely to ever really be able to be manufactured. So, that's part of it. Now, a few technological things you should know. One is that this is an older drug, as is remdesivir and some others. Drugs don't pop out of nowhere. Development takes time, and I mean years and years. This was filed for patent in late 2018, which means it was probably developed 2017, 2016, maybe earlier. Unfortunately, patents are some of the world's worst documents to have to read because of all the legalese in them. So this is it. If you want to look it up, it's available on Google Patents. It is where the original idea came from, where I was a faculty member at Emory University. And so what you get, though, is something that looks more like this, is where it's legally available. You get the legalese, some about the funding, and then you get down here eventually a little bit of background, and then you get something like this, which is a nightmare structurally. Just so we get this clear, every one of these R's is a potential variable. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. X, Y, and Z here are potentially variables. So 6, 7, 8. There are 8 potential variable groups on this structure. There are literally hundreds of compounds in this patent that were tested against various viruses. Not coronavirus at the time, or not the COVID-19 coronavirus at the time, because it wasn't known at that time. What it was tested against was Ebola and other viruses of the time, along with all of its cousins and relatives with these various structural variables. So aside from legalese, patents tend to be claiming that everything involved since the dawn of time is somehow covered by this patent. So they tend to be a little bit uninformative, but this is the original report. So it is a big deal. Now, more useful is when we actually get something that's journal article wise. Now, this is an updated synthesis of the same molecule, but the idea is journals don't have to have 10 million variables. Journals don't have to cover every legal avenue. Journals just get to the point. So this is an updated synthesis from 2021 by a faculty member at MIT. And we're not going to go into the actual updated synthesis, but because he's making a molecule that's been made before, he does us a favor here and summarizes that patent in one image. So here's the actual original stuff from that patent to make the molecule we care about instead of making 10 million variations. So what you'll notice here, a couple of things. One, here's the question one that I mentioned. We're going to talk about this again in the next video, but here's question one, the formation of the acetal. Here's question two, the formation of the ester here. Later on, we get removing the acetal, which is what happens down here from the acetal in structure 6 to remove to the diol again in structure 7, and then just cleaned up, so structure 7 again, but after recrystallization. So, a few things. Journal articles tend to get to the point. They also tend to somewhat inflate their own importance because you want people to take notice of what you've done, what you've improved, or what you've discovered. So it tends to be worded in such a way where it seems like you've just discovered heliocentrism. So that's not always the case. But some of what they say is relevant. Now, in this case, the original synthesis was difficult. A lot of steps, overall yield something like 15-17%. As you can see, none of these steps are great. 29% yield here, 60% yield here. Esters, of course, are relatively easy to make, so almost 100% yield there. So the idea is this was low yielding and difficult. So again, not something you want to scale up to the ton scale and try to save the world with. The idea of a paper like this is that you get some improvements. So this case, their version starts from a different material, but higher yield and, more importantly, more easily scaled up. So easier to do on a big scale, which is important if you're going to talk about treating literally millions of people with this in a short period of time. So important parts about this drug. One, it is relatively easy to make, which means a factory to make this could be set up virtually anywhere on Earth that has any ability to do manufacturing, which is even the poorest countries could basically set up a factory to make this, help their own people. The materials involved are not difficult to come by, not terribly expensive, not impossible to make the way that antibodies are, for instance, and the storage and the dosing of it are relatively simple. It's difficult to get IV equipment in some areas of the world. Anyone, anywhere can take a pill, and that's the idea. This is the first real treatment that is a pill. It is not an injection. It is not an intravenous infusion. So especially in areas where the vaccine is not available, this is the type of thing that could be the difference between life and death, is get them something they can take and that they can get relatively quickly once they're infected. Because if you don't have the vaccine, you will get infected, especially in higher populated areas. So that's the point of this exam, and that's why you see this in the news so much lately, is because it really does represent the possibility of slowing the spread of this virus down. And in areas where the vaccine's not available, that's where mutations are most likely to happen, to give us one that then comes back and bites the vaccinated because it learns to evade it. The virus mutates in such a way where eventually a mutation will occur that will evade the existing vaccines and require new ones. That's why we have to get things like flu shots every year, because the virus mutates every year, more often than every year. But that's the idea, that this is going to get made and administered worldwide, but more importantly in areas where the vaccine is not manufacturable and not readily available, so that in areas where 1% of the population is vaccinated, they're going to have massive numbers of deaths and infections. This could help with that a big deal, because you don't have to then get, the current vaccines, the 2 mRNA vaccines require cold storage. They have to be stored at minus 78 degrees C, which means they have to be shipped that way. Which is one thing if you're talking about packing something in dry ice and shipping it from Maryland to New Jersey. That's a different thing if you're talking about shipping it from a factory in Maryland to Southwest Africa. It's not going to work. You can't store and ship things the same way over long distances. So if you don't have that manufacturing capacity, then you're not using that vaccine. There are other options coming up, but as far as the ones that we have right now, the 2 most common ones that seem to be the most effective are both messenger RNA based and therefore require the cold storage and very cold shipping. Without that infrastructure in place to be able to do that, then those vaccines are just not available to you, even if you could get them shipped. So this is a drug that may change that. It will not be the only one, but it's the one that's on its way to approval right now and is the first one that's actually orally dosed, just a pill. Or I think it's like 5 or 6 pills. But the point is not requiring you to be in a hospital to dose it, not requiring an infusion center, not requiring sterile equipment, not requiring anything other than basically, a bottle of it and a glass of water to take it with. So that's the type of mindset we're going to need to treat something that is a worldwide problem. So that's why I wanted you to know a little bit more about this. That's why I wanted to use it as a model, because it is not an overly complicated structure. Compared to some of the examples in your book, we're just using acetone and, making a simple acetal. Yes, it looks really ugly. But in terms of drug molecules, this is very small and relatively simple. So it's a good place for you to start seeing how the real world works.